The living room of Lovetta's house was a chaotic mix of desperation and fear. The furniture had been pushed aside to make space, the curtains drawn tightly to keep out the prying eyes of the night. Candles flickered on every surface, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to dance with malevolent intent. The air was heavy with the scent of incense and the echoes of whispered prayers. Lovetta's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Okoye, stood to the side, their faces pale and drawn. Mrs. Okoye clutched a rosary in her trembling hands, her lips moving in silent prayer, while Mr. Okoye held her close, his expression one of helplessness and dread. Their daughter, once so full of life, now lay on the floor. Her body twisted and contorted, her eyes glowing with a sickly, unnatural light. The demon inside her was strong, and it had taken over every part of her being. Reverend James, the exorcist priest, stood at the center of the room, his brow furrowed in concentration as he held up a crucifix, his voice steady but strained as he chanted the words of the exorcism. Lovetta's body convulsed violently with each word, the demon within her fighting with all its might to remain in control. "By the power of God, I command you to leave this innocent soul." Reverend James' voice rang out, firm and unwavering, though the strain was evident in his eyes. He splashed holy water over Lovett, and her skin sizzled where the drops landed. A hiss escaping from her lips as the demon recoiled. The battle raged on, minutes stretching into agonizing hours. Lovetta's screams filled the room, her voice twisted and distorted by the demon that held her captive. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing colder as the struggle reached its peak. Reverend James' voice grew hoarse, his energy nearly depleted, but he refused to stop. And then, with a final, earth-shattering scream, Lovetta's body arched upward, her back bending at an unnatural angle. The light in her eyes flickered and then faded, leaving them dull and empty as she collapsed onto the floor, still and silent. For a moment, the room was eerily quiet, the only sound the ragged breathing of those who had witnessed the horrific scene. Father Michael lowered the crucifix, his hands shaking as he reached out to check Lovetta's pulse. Relief washed over him as he felt the faint thump beneath his fingers. She was alive. "She's free," he said, his voice thick with exhaustion and emotion. "The demon is gone." Lovetta's parents rushed to her side, Mrs. Okoye falling to her knees as she cradled her daughter's head in her lap, sobbing with relief. Mr. Okoye knelt beside them, his hand resting on Lovetta's shoulder. His eyes filled with gratitude. But as they rejoiced, the demon slipped out of the room unnoticed and unseen. The demon had indeed been cast out of Lovett, but it had not been destroyed. It slithered through the cracks in the walls, out into the night, searching for a new host. A few streets away, a young woman walked down the road, unaware of the terror that had just transpired. She hummed softly to herself, her steps light and carefree as she made her way home. The night was calm, the air warm with a gentle breeze. The demon found her. In an instant, her body jerked violently, her head snapping back as the demon took hold. Her eyes, once bright and clear, clouded over with a dark, sinister light. She stumbled, her breath catching in her throat as she fought against the sudden wave of fear and confusion that gripped her. But it was too late. The demon had claimed her. As Lovetta's parents wept with relief inside their home, believing the nightmare to be over, the darkness continued its journey, now lurking within the unsuspecting figure of a young woman walking alone under the night sky. Lovett woke the next morning, the weight of her ordeal pressing down on her like a heavy shroud. The previous night's events lingered in the air, a thick fog of terror and sorrow that refused to dissipate. She lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, the memories of the demon's torment still fresh in her mind. But there was something else, something even more painful that gnawed at her soul. It was the memory of her friends, her 4 closest companions, whose lives had been tragically cut short in the midst of the nightmare. Her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Okoye, entered her room quietly, their faces etched with concern. They had hardly slept, their minds consumed with the horror of what had happened to their daughter. Lovett looked up at them, her eyes filled with a mix of guilt and fear. She knew she had to tell them everything about the demon, about her friends, about the deadly consequences of their ill-fated decisions. "Mom, Dad," she began, her voice trembling. "There's something I need to tell you." Mr. Okoye sat beside her, taking her hand in his. "We are here for you, Lovett. Whatever it is, we'll face it together." Lovett took a deep breath, then recounted the whole saga, the summoning of the demon, the pact they had made, and the horror that had followed. She spoke of her 4 best friends, the girls who had been like sisters to her, and how they had all been drawn into the dark web of the supernatural. She described how the demon had slowly turned their lives into a living hell, claiming the lives of her friends one by one until she was the only one left. As she spoke, tears streamed down her face, her voice breaking with the weight of the truth. "It's all my fault," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "If I hadn't agreed to that stupid ritual, they'd still be alive." Mrs. Okoye's heart broke for her daughter. She reached out, pulling Lovett into a tight embrace. "Oh, my darling," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "You were all just children, playing with something far beyond your understanding. It wasn't your fault." Mr. Okoye, his eyes glistening with tears, nodded in agreement. "We can't change the past, Lovett. What's done is done. But we can choose how we move forward." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of the tragedy hanging heavy in the room. Lovetta's parents exchanged a look, a silent understanding passing between them. They knew what had to be done. "We forgive you, Lovett," Mr. Okoye said softly, his voice firm but gentle. "We love you, and nothing will ever change that. But we need to make amends for what happened, for the sake of your friends and their families." The next morning, Lovett and her parents prepared themselves for the difficult task ahead. They knew they had to visit the homes of Lovetta's 4 best friends, houses that had been turned into places of mourning. The thought of facing the grieving families filled them with dread, but they knew it was the right thing to do. The drive to each house was solemn, the air inside the car thick with tension. Lovett sat in the back seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea how her friends' families would react, but she knew she had to try. She owed it to her friends. The first stop was Amanda's house. Her parents, who had aged visibly since their daughter's death, opened the door with weary eyes. When they saw Lovett and her parents standing there, the air grew tense, but they let them in. Lovett, barely able to meet their gaze, fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry," she choked out, her voice shaking with emotion. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Please, forgive me." Amanda's mother, a woman who had once been full of warmth and laughter, looked at Lovett with a mix of sorrow and anger. Her husband placed a hand on her shoulder, giving her the strength to speak. "What happened was tragic, Lovett," she said slowly. "Our daughter is gone, and nothing can bring her back. But you were her friend, and I know she wouldn't want us to hold on to this anger forever." Amanda's father nodded, his eyes filled with unshed tears. "We forgive you, Lovett. It won't be easy, but we have to let go and try to heal." Lovett sobbed, overcome with relief and grief. Her parents stepped forward, offering words of condolence, and after what felt like an eternity. They left the house, having found a sliver of peace. The visits to the other 3 houses followed in a similar fashion, each family torn between their sorrow and the need for closure. Lovetta's apologies were met with varying degrees of acceptance, but in the end, each family chose to forgive, understanding that their daughters had loved Lovett, and that holding on to anger would only prolong their pain. After what seemed like the longest day of their lives, Lovett and her parents returned home, their hearts heavy but a little lighter with the knowledge that they had done what they could to make amends. A few days later, the funeral for Lovetta's 4 best friends was held. The families decided to bury the girls together, a final act of unity in life and death. The cemetery was filled with mourners, people who had known the girls, who had loved them, and who were devastated by the loss of such young lives. Lovett stood at a distance with her parents, her eyes fixed on the 4 caskets that were being lowered into the ground. Each casket was identical, adorned with flowers and mementos from the girls' short lives. The sight was almost too much to bear, and Lovett felt a crushing weight on her chest as she watched the earth swallow up her friends. The priest's voice droned on, offering words of comfort and prayers for the departed. But Lovett barely heard him. All she could think about was how different things could have been, how they should have been planning their futures together, not burying their dreams in the cold ground. After the ceremony, Lovett approached the graves, her parents close behind. She knelt by each one, placing a single white rose on the freshly turned earth. Her tears fell freely as she whispered her final goodbyes, her heart breaking with each word. "I'm so sorry," she said over and over, her voice hoarse with grief. "I'll never forget you. I carry you with me always." Her parents stood by her, their hands resting on her shoulders, offering silent support. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the cemetery, and as the last rays of light disappeared behind the horizon, Lovett felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. It wasn't the end of her pain, she knew that grief would be her companion for a long time to come, but it was the beginning of healing. The journey would be long and difficult, but with her parents by her side, she knew she could face whatever came next. As they walked away from the graves, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the echoes of laughter and friendship. Lovett closed her eyes, letting the sound wash over her, and for a brief moment, she could almost feel her friends beside her, guiding her forward into a future where their memories would live on.